We don't have to listen to this here. Are we exempt?
You are exempt, yeah. You know, as the car would change balance, they would still be touching, and they outlawed that pretty fast. So these are your weight jackers.
Well, we just hopped in this van that came out of the secret basement of the Indianapolis Motor Speedway Museum, and we're with Luke Edwards, and he's going to take us over to the restoration shop.
Previous owners of the track, the Holman family, were involved in the start of a race team called Howe Racing. They have two small buildings out there that were perfectly set up for car restoration.
So this is going to be the first former IndyCar race shop that we're going to go into. I didn't even know that.
It's definitely not the first former one, but it is probably one of the last ones that's still intact and, you know, still has the primary structure up.
The first one that we have ever been into. We have not done, us personally have not done anything in the IndyCar at all yet.
We've got a real special IndyCar in there right now.
Which one of these buildings was the first shop?
Both of them.
Both of them?
Yeah, they were built at the same time. Early 50s or mid 50s, I'm pretty sure.
Wow.
So don't yell at me in the comments if I'm off.
I'll figure it out. This is the first IndyCar shop we will have ever been in, and it is the oldest. We don't have to listen to this here. Are we exempt?
You are exempt, yeah. Just
how about that? We have exclusive access to this place. Yep, see, you learn something every time you come into here, into these places. We always pick up these little tips of organization and use them in our own garage.
We do the same thing. So this is our big project that we have going on right now. This is the 1963 Lotus 29, chassis number 1. Dan Gurney drove this car. It was a big moment in Indy 500 history because the roadsters, the front engine roadsters, tube frame cars really ruled the roost. They just were the staple of American open wheel racing. Dan Gurney had already been running and kind of experimenting with a Mickey Thompson built rear engine car at the 500. He had run it in 1962. He ran into Colin Chapman and already had a Ford connection, kind of built that relationship, and brought over Jim Clark and Colin Chapman from Lotus and brought this, what they call funny car in the States, which is an all aluminum monocoque. So, you know, no tube frame chassis here, super lightweight, weighs about 1,100 pounds. Compared to the roadsters of the day that weighed about 1,500 pounds. And they took a variation of their 260 stock block pushrod engine, carbureted V8. So this is a 256 cubic inch Ford R engine with Weber carburetors.
So this looks like a standard small block Ford, but it's got extra head bolts down there.
Yeah.
Is that where the R?
Now I'm not sure where the R came from. I just know that's the designation. But
I'll have to do some more digging on that because a standard small block Ford does not have these head bolt provisions down here. It's just this top row.
That's interesting. Yeah, I don't work with the standard motors too much. I'm just around these modified deals, but this really jumped Ford back into the game. You know, at this time they were also developing the GT40, and then they turned to the 4Cam Ford engine. And the 4Cam Ford, they actually switched the intakes and the exhaust. They had what we refer to as the bag of snakes exhaust that came out, so it just had better airflow, so they kind of shortcutted everything, and that engine dominated. It won in 1965 with Jim Clark for the first time, and then it was continually developed into an engine that Ed Pink ended up working with.
Is that the engine that AJ Foyt ended up buying?
Yes.
We saw one of those engines in the Speedway Motors Museum, where you're talking about it's like a hot V design where the headers come out in here. Yes, I know exactly what you're talking about.
Yeah, so it ran naturally aspirated for a few years. It won a couple races like that, and then by the late 60s, early 70s, they started turbocharging them because the Offie started catching back up. And an Offie's an old design. It's the winningest motor at the 500, and it's an inline 4-cylinder turbo engine. So it started outpacing the 4Cam Ford engines, and then Ford said, okay, looks like turbo is the way to go. So they started turbocharging the 4Cam Fords, and then Foyt bought basically all the machining, all the rights to that motor, all the blueprints, and then he put his name on the engine cover. So we can check one of those out over in the museum. We've got a couple of them.
That'll be cool to see.
But yeah, here's one of the Foyt engines.
This is just, because I know Dan Gurney comes to mind as the Gurney bubble, the GT4, just because he was a taller dude. How the heck do you fit in this car? It's not even a car. It's just only big enough to hold a person, an engine, and put wheels on it.
Oh yeah.
It's insane.
Yeah, we call them cigar cars. As you can see by the shape, there's nothing else to them. And the funny thing is, you know, Dan's shoulders stuck out a little bit, but not too much in this car. And the car was developed for Jim Clark, who is much smaller. So, I mean, Dan found a way to kind of like origami himself into these cockpits of these really small cars. And he did pretty well in this as well. He originally was supposed to drive the number 2 chassis. He wrecked that one in practice, so they put him in the number 1. They only had 3 total, so they just had 1 backup. I believe he finished 7th in this car, and his teammate Jim Clark finished 2nd. So this car right here is one of the catalysts of the IndyCar that we know today. Rear engine, low to the ground, lightweight. This is what put the front engine roadsters on notice and kind of let everybody know, well, the European teams are here, they're coming, they're married with American brands and American power, and it ended up being a winning strategy. It was about 370 some horsepower. Some of the figures I've seen when they first started developing it were around 325, and then they got up to about 376 on the dyno. And I saw some figures that said they got, by the end of the season in '63, got up to 380 plus horsepower on a dyno with this. And you got to think about, you know, almost 400 horsepower in something that weighs 1,100 pounds. It's a rocket ship.
1,100 with the engine and like ready to go, not just the chassis.
Yeah, 1,100 like
that is insane.
And then it still could mid-corner at about 142 miles an hour at the Indianapolis Motor Speedway here, which was about 5 miles an hour faster than the best roadster mid-apex full load. And this qualified, you know what, I actually did look this up. Its average speed here, I think, was 149 in qualifying. I don't have the exact figure, but I think it was 149.0 in qualifying. So you're top ending, you know, 170 at the end of the straight, because they still had to let off the gas and have weight transfer and everything back then.
Where did you guys find this car? Like, how much of this was found in its original state or recreated? I mean, this intake manifold looks like it was probably original, and these headers probably work as welder technology was not.
Right.
It was not up to snuff with what we have today. So
it's almost all original. We've gone through, and you know, when we do these restorations, we'll replace lines, but we try to keep everything as original as possible. It was actually preserved. Ford had it at their museum, and then they donated it to us. So you'll see things like lines, you know, to run the car. We'll replace lines. You might replace some fittings, some screws, but we try to keep everything, such as the bodywork, the main components of the car, the suspension components. If we can refinish something, if we can recoat something, that's usually the way that we go. We try to not fabricate something unless it's missing or, you know, beyond repair.
So now we're in the actual museum part.
So this exhibit was all picked by the fans. So we put a vote out. We had a big pool of cars, and we just let all the fans vote. You could vote however many times you wanted. So if you're really passionate about a car, you could vote every single day for that car. And we've got our results right over here on this board. The 1964 Lotus took the cake. It won by a large margin. Mario's car was third there, the 72.
Smoky Eunuch.
And this is the first time we've ever done anything like this, so it was really fun. And that VPJ, that Mario car, actually has a big Ed Pink connection, because Vels Parnelli Jones was the first team that approached Ed to help them develop some, I think it was some connecting rods, and they were converting their Formula One V8 Cosworth DFV into a turbocharged Indy Cosworth V8. And he was so impressive to them that from what I understand, they brought him in, and 6 teams ended up hiring him to build full motors, and we have one of those motors back here. So
I like how everything is just kind of on the floor.
Yeah.
I don't like going into museums that everything is like up on a pedestal. You can't get 10 feet away from it. Like here, you can actually go look at the car and see the details of it, and not feel like it's, you know, not even real.
And we do want to let guests get close enough to really like see what the cars are made of, what they look like. And of course, if you're like any race fan or car fan, what's the first thing you do? You try to look into the driver's seat, right? See what the cockpit looks like. But yeah, this is one of our Ed Pink motors right here. This is one of the 6 teams that he worked with, Tim Richmond's team. And the chassis that this is in is actually a Penske chassis that they bought. It's a year old, so it was a 1979 called a PC7. He won Rookie of the Year in this. He finished 9th. So he had a great performance. He actually ran the car out of fuel on the lap trying to get back into the pits after the finish, and hopped on Johnny Rutherford's car and rode back down into the pits because he was stranded on the north end of the track, and Johnny had just won. He was feeling it, so he saw Tim standing there, and he's like, "You run out of gas?" He's like, "Yeah." He's like, "Hop on." And Tim had this famous quote. He's like, "Well, if you can't win, then ride in with the winner. It's the next best thing." So,
yeah, if you didn't know, Tim Richmond had an IndyCar career before he came to NASCAR, which I think he's mostly known for NASCAR.
absolutely. The story I always heard is that his mom saw a crash that he was in and was like, "Nope, you're not racing IndyCar anymore." I don't know if that's an old tale, but
I mean, that makes sense because I'm pretty sure he was family backed for a very long time.
yeah.
I don't blame her.
Can I step over this to see the cockpit?
Look at the seat.
It's very tiny. Holy tiny steering wheel. Looks like some aircraft gauges in there. Yeah, that's pretty crazy. You said you had this in here because when we were at Ed's a couple weeks ago, one of the pictures on his wall was him standing with Tim.
Really?
Probably for this car.
Yeah, and I believe by this point, I'm sure Ed spoke more onto this, that he was actually doing the full engine builds for Tim's team, and I believe Tom Sneva's as well.
Look at that massive wastegate. Turbo system technology has come a long way.
And on these cars, they obviously have like their own wastegate right on the turbo, but they mandated on top of the plenum what they called a blow-off valve, and these were a sanctioning body in this age. It was called CART, Championship Auto Racing Teams. So they all had a regulated blow-off valve. So if it exceeded a certain pressure, it would pop off. Of course, teams would try to fiddle with those, especially in qualifying. But the key was you wanted to get as close as you could, because if that thing released, you lose all boost pressure, and then you've got to wind the thing back up. So teams would try to pull this dance of getting as close as possible without triggering that thing.
Once it was triggered, would it come back down, or was it stuck open and you were screwed?
It would come back down. It's spring operated, so it's actually mechanical. So it would shut back down, but the release, I'm sure they would lose a little bit more pressure than the maximum.
I believe Tim's family, I think his dad invented some machine to tunnel under roads to
Really?
like run pipelines and stuff. That's where Tim Richmond's career was funded from, I believe.
Well, they say to make a small fortune in racing, you've got to start with a big one. So
Yeah.
Do any of these cars run?
In this exhibit, I mean, almost all of them can run. We've just been focusing on the winning cars lately.
Okay.
The Lotus can run. I believe the VPJ can run. But these will be later on our list. Our top priority was get as many winning Indy 500 cars running is possible.
You can pause and read these.
So nothing has oil in it, because I don't see any drip pans.
If they have any fluid in them, you'll see it on the floor. It's just the way it is. But we pickle all of the engines, especially anything alcohol, fuel. So we need to wash all that out because it can cause so much corrosion if it's sitting in the block. And Sneva's car, we ran that this year. But yeah, here's one of the Foyt engines. You can see it says Foyt on the cam cover there.
Oh wow, I just saw the FO, I just figured it said Ford. I didn't even notice the...
I haven't seen that before. That's a good point. It looks just like the Ford one. You see the FO and just assume.
Yeah.
I mean, look at that.
Oh, no, it is. It's exactly the same.
Yeah.
Notice these transaxles have the little prop shaft sticking out the back of them. Did they like start the car with those or something? What was the purpose of that?
Yeah, so it was outboard starters, and that's still how they start the Indy cars today.
Really? That is
If you
interesting.
move that cab, you should be able to see the teeth.
Yep. Little splined output shaft there. That's pretty cool. I'm really trying not to mess this up. See, I'm glad you told me to do that, because that's why I asked to step over this, because I knew what you were going to say. But in other videos where it says, do not touch, and I start touching stuff, even though we're allowed to, the comments like, the sign says don't touch. Why are you touching stuff? Like, you don't think that they said go open the, open the cabinet and stuff.
I'll call in the yellow shirts, we'll
they-
have them run in here and scream at us. Actually, our docents are so on
Al
it.
Unser car.
Well, there's lots to look at in here.
It's got a
We can
Cosworth.
look at whatever you want to, for sure.
Sorry.
So yeah, that's the first Cosworth DFX to win the race.
I like how they use the inches of mercury instead of pounds per square inch for manifold pressure.
So in this row, one of the Johnny Lightning's runs, and I'm talking the last 5 years, we run, one of the Johnny Lightning motors is good, so we'll swap it out depending on which one we want to run that year. The 1978 is Lola. This runs as well. We ran this, I think last year, or the year before. This is the 1980 winner. We just ran this year. We took this apart, similar to the Lotus, down to every single fitting. Every single nut and bolt was taken apart. We refinished almost anything that was metallic and had a finish on it. So this was, I wouldn't call it a full restoration, but it was pretty
Oh, it's
close.
the pretty Pennzoil yellow.
It is?
Yeah.
Oh, wow. I did not know that the pearlescent Pennzoil yellow went back this far. You said...
Yeah.
This is 1980?
Yep.
So this is the car that Tim Richmond rode on.
Yes, and this was developed, if you come to the back of the car, with some massive diffusers. So this is when that's 1978, and this is ground effects. So if you look at the difference in the two cars, if you bring the camera down here, you can see the massive tunnels using the
wow.
Bernoulli principle to create that, the faster moving air underneath the car compared to the air going over the top, turn the entire car into a wing itself.
Now, when this car won, were there still cars in the field that looked like that?
Oh,
like,
absolutely.
Was this one of like the cars that were, when they pulled it, were like, holy crap, what did they do? We're screwed.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, and it came out in 1979, and Al Unser was driving one, and they had a few mechanical issues. I think they had a fuel pump or something go out in the car. But yeah, this was another moment, similar to the Lotus, where it's like, well, now we all have to adapt. Now we all have to change the game. And then you go to 1982, and you see that they've developed the floor of the cars, and of course the technical regs would start trying to catch up and slow them down. And, but from this point forward, you know, ground effects became a part of the game of developing a car.
Look at how much they can move the wing on this one too, compared to others. Like
Yeah,
all the notches on the side.
That's a lot of adjustability.
And this was inspired by the championship-winning Lotus in F1. So if you look at Mario Andretti's championship Lotus car from F1, and you look at the profile of this, it's like, oh, okay, I can kind of see where
Was
they
that
got the
78 when Mario won the?
idea. Either 78 or 79.
Interesting.
And then this is another Ed Pink motor. Of course, the bodywork is covering it up a little bit more.
We believe you. It's in there.
And I've actually got some GoPro footage of this running and some external stuff I can send you so you can hear it. And
That would be really cool. Is it a Cosworth?
yep, yeah, Cosworth V8 DFX.
I'd love to
These
have
were
it.
all 161 cubic inch, so about 2.6 liter. Big single turbo. And this is a March 83 seat chassis. You can see they're still utilizing an aluminum monocoque on the bottom, but they've started utilizing carbon fiber up here and around the dash area.
When did they go to full carbon and get rid of the aluminum?
One of the first ones is right over here in 1986. So this is again another March chassis. And this is one of the last ones, like when you take it fully apart, there's still a little aluminum at the very bottom, you can see right there.
Oh yeah. How much? That main,
Yeah.
the main frame rail is carbon.
And I believe 88, the Penske chassis were full carbon. And the closest thing we have to bridge that gap is what we call the hot one, the 1990 Domino's winner with Arie Luyendyk, who also ran with Ed Pink engines a little bit before he won the 500.
Who were the other prominent engine builders during that time? Like who was winning races back then?
Well, you had the Ilmor factory, and Ilmor was developing the Chevy engines, and that was a Penske fronted movement. So in, I believe it was 1986, he had a special Penske chassis that he brought in. He also had some March chassis, and he brought in one car that ran the race with a Chevy, and the development was so promising that they went ahead and moved forward with it. And then you had what they called the Chevy Indy V8 engine, and that's what's also in here. That's what took Rick Mears to victory in '88 and '91. So Ilmor is still involved in the game. They still build the Chevy engines that are currently in the Indy cars. They built the Beast, which was a Mercedes badged engine.
I was going to ask you if you had any of those here.
We have, I think we're kind of babysitting one that's in the basement because Roger just did some sort of deal, but we don't own the car. Roger owns that car, and it won the 94 500. But yeah, the same design firm, the same engineering firm built that. But you can see 1990, this is when they first switched to digital dashes. That's what we call a Pi dash. And you'll see that same dash used all the way through the early 2000s. And that was peak technology back in the day. At this point, the gear shifts, they're sequential.
read my mind. That's what this little knob is down here.
Yep, so they're at this point they're not using the clutch when they're at speed. They're only using it in the pits, and it's just sequential, just up and down. You're not doing H pattern anymore.
What is those two little levers down there?
So these are your weight jackers. So you have front and rear, and essentially what that does is you have a torsion bar that's shaped like this in between your springs. And when it's upright, it has more flex to it. And you can rotate it down to be completely flat so that it's pretty stiff. And that controls the give and the load. So on an oval, what you're really using that for is what you'd almost call a weight jacker. So in the rear, if you're stiffening the rear, as you go into the corner and the car loads up, it's not going to depress the suspension quite as much. So you're going to have more weight transferred to the front. If you soften it, it's going to allow more roll to the outside, and you're going to have more weight essentially go to the rear of the car. So they can change the balance at speed.
Was that ever outlawed, or are they still able to do that?
They still do that. Now it's all on steering wheel controls. It's electronically controlled now, but they have everything from that to brake bias. Now the only thing you can't adjust is like active aero. They don't allow anything like that, but you can completely change the balance of your car in the race. And one of the cool things with qualifying here at Indy, they have 4 laps, and they have a sequence that they've developed with their engineers. So each driver will talk with his engineer and be like, what's going to happen to this car as we do these 4 laps completely on edge, and the tires start to wear out, we're on the very limit of grip. They'll have a little sequence. They'll be like, okay, you move to this position on lap 2. Okay, on the back stretch of lap 2, then you go 1 more. And then on the front stretch of lap 3, you go 1 more. And they'll kind of chase the balance just to keep the car underneath them for those 4 laps.
Are there any cars in here that had any innovations that were so good that they were outlawed?
The skirts on the 1980 car were outlawed. You could see they're taken off. When they first took the car out, they designed these rubber skirts to actually be on a hinge, and you can, if we had the bodywork taken off, you can see them, but they'd fall down to the ground, and as the car would change balance, they would still be touching.
Interesting.
And they outlawed that pretty fast.
So was that an evolution of that?
Yeah, and those are rubber as well. If you touch, you can kind of see how they're flexible. But that using the Bernoulli principle the way they did with this really essentially took the concept of one singular wing and applied it to the entire shape of the car so that it would behave in the same manner. So that's really where they started developing the really high speeds where you're hitting, Tom Steva in 84, the year after he won, he was the first one to qualify at an average higher than 210. And then you get into the 220s, 230s, and then one of the cars we looked at in our collection, your favorites, is the record-holding car that qualified at an average of 237. And you're hitting top speeds at 250 in the mid-90s. So,
was this car, like the bodywork on it, was it repainted? Like, was this car used as something else after it won, or was it like mothballed because it was the race winner and stayed in this shape? Like, is this original paint?
There's 2 schools of thought. From the official records, it was just preserved. And then we've heard things from some other mechanics. Butch Hartman told me that they actually tried to redevelop one of these into a Pat Patrick car. And I think it was 83 that John Cock drove and Johnny Rutherford tried to qualify one. But at that point, the design was already a little bit outdated and a little slower for what the rules packages had adjusted to. But as far as the records that we've seen, they just kind of preserved it. And I mean, this one, when we went through it, we actually didn't have to do anything to the bodywork. Everything that we did was under the skin. So like, these are all, refreshed and recoded.
Like the hand lettering in that,
Yeah,
70s psychedelic Pennzoil logo.
You can't beat that.
No. I'm sure somebody at a like a brand meeting would not like you taking that creative liberty, but it's the stuff like that that is like, it gives a character.
Absolutely.
Because down here it's not hand lettered. That's
and
like
on
a stencil.
The side there, it's straight as well.
Yeah.
You couldn't get away with that nowadays. That's a good point.
One thing I did notice on this Johnny Lightning car is
We did talk about it.
How they had these scoops in here just to direct air to cool the wastegate off.
Yeah, I have asked about that before. I've never gotten a clear answer on it, but
It must
they
have
must have
gotten,
been having some sort of overheating trouble.
must have got so hot that it would stick or fail or.
And that
something.
overheating was an issue with this car. I never heard anything specific about the wastegate, but their kind of pre-race game plan was if you can keep the engine cool and the engine temp down and we don't overheat, you're going to win the race. I never heard anything more specific than that, but. And you can see the foil too. They're obviously trying to keep heat away from other components.
Can you only imagine how hot he was?
I know, like there's nothing about this is comfortable whatsoever. You're really in it with everything you got.
And these cars, back in this day, they would develop the car around the driver. So like Al Unser had some pretty narrow hips, so they just made the car as narrow as they possibly could to save space and save weight.
Al Unser autographed the side of it in there.
Oh wow. Yeah, I wonder if guys like him and Mario Andretti, I guess not Al anymore because he recently passed away, but if they would, in their older state, come look at one of these cars and just think themselves like, wow, how did I not die? How am I still here? Like this is terrible. This is like you had to you had to be prepared for that.
It's just amazing when you hear him recount. We get to talk to Mario a lot, and he always has good stories. They were surrounded by the danger all the time. They might even lose friends every now and then, but they were so focused on winning that in their mind the safest thing to do was usually be the fastest guy and have the most control over your car and understand how it was going to handle and what it was going to do. And AJ Foyt has a famous quote when he was in this race in '67 on the final lap, coming down the main straightaway to the checkered flag. 3 cars wrecked in front of him and there was smoke everywhere and he couldn't see. And he said, well, I downshifted into second gear and I figured if I hit something, I was gonna push it across the finish line.
Okay.
So they just had that mentality of, win first. That's the most important thing.
As everything we've talked about so far has been rear engine. What was the pinnacle of the front engine car?
Right behind you. That's AJ Foyt's 1964 winning roadster.
And this is the last one that won before the one that we just looked at.
We don't have the 65 winner, but this is the last roadster, the last front engine car to ever win the Indy 500. So it's a naturally aspirated Offenhauser 4-cylinder. And he was the last one to hold him off, and Clark and him were kind of going back and forth with the lead, and Jim Clark had Dunlop tires, and the tread compound kind of chunked up and caused a vibration, which ended up causing a suspension failure. And when Clark dropped out, Foyt held the rest of the rear engine guys off and won.
Also, he was racing against rear engine cars at this point still.
Yes, yeah, so 62, 63, and 64, there was kind of that shift of like, well, these guys are showing up in the rear engine cars now, and Foyt and Parnelli and AJ Watson, they were the ones developing these cars and continuing to try to get a mile or two out of them, just to kind of stay on the old guard side of things and keep the Indy Roadster alive. Even by 65 and 66, there were still roadsters out there. There were some guys that either didn't have the money and had an old roadster and were trying to make the show, or just kind of like the old ways, like Jim Hurtubise. If you look up some stories about him, and he hung on to the roadster. He had a roadster dubbed a mallard after his favorite animal, the mallard duck, and he was the last one to qualify a roadster. I think it was either 67 or 68. So he was hanging in there with those rear engine rocket ships for a while.
It's kind of funny, the hand lettering on this, or the hand painting on this, because the point isn't where it should be.
Yeah.
And this is race damage from Phoenix. So he wanted to keep it this way. I know another timeline significant one is the first Roadster.
Car over there was raced in a NASCAR race too.
Really?
Yeah. That's one over here, the blue one.
The Knockout?
Yeah.
So their car exists that did both of them?
Yeah. There was a short time where they could, the rules were changed a little bit.
1952 Buck Baker drove it.
Oh, the Speedway division. I've heard of that before.
Still NASCAR.
Yeah. Short-lived Speedway division.
46 post-war, and you can see that they sit a little bit higher. You have some dirt cars here that won the 500. Again, they sit a little bit higher. And then you come to this 1953 Curtis Roadster. And one of the questions we get all the time is like, what designates a Roadster from, you know, another front engine race car? And if you look down in the cockpit area, you'll see that the drivetrain is over to the side. So if you look down here, and they figured out that by laying the engine down on its side, they could have the driveline go beside the driver instead of underneath and lower that center of gravity. And the term came from Billy Vukovich showing up and seeing this Curtis craft and saying, hey, that looks like my old Roadster hot rod back home. And they dubbed it the Roadster. And that's how the Indy Roadster came to be for about a decade and a couple years before it was overshadowed by the Lotus.
I mean, just this building is really neat. So like these are probably original cabinets to the shop.
Yes. Yeah, and some workbenches have come and gone, but I mean, you can see a lot of the tools and stuff up on the walls. They've been here for decades. We've got some files over here for whatever they're working on. And we can fit up to 3 cars in the bay. We usually just do 2 to keep it nice and neat. And we have our restoration lead, and then we have 4 techs. So we have 4 bays per tech. This is Dave Papalaris. We call him Poppy. He's been around the sport forever. He won with Jacques Villeneuve in the 500 in 1995. He's been on championship winning teams, and this has been kind of his baby, his project to see it through to the end. So we're right in the middle of it right now, and we're looking forward to getting it fully put back together and hopefully running at some point.
Date code on these brakes, 15/5/63. So that's like the European way of saying what the day is, where they put the day first, then the month, then the year.
Yeah.
You know, and like the smallest to biggest kind of sort of makes more sense that way, but.
And you can see when you look at the more modern cars, a lot of these ideas of the suspension, you know, this is a rudimentary version of like a lower A-arm, but it's kind of the same motion concept that got carried over into the open wheel cars that we know today.
It's really interesting to think about how the guys of this era would figure out their, you know, camber gain and all that stuff. Just they didn't have computer programs to model this. They would probably just build it and then just sit here and just move it up and down and look at it. Like measure it up here, measure it down there, and
it was very visual too. They would, you know, put their teammate or a mechanic out in the corner of the track and watch the behavior of the car just visually. And in this era, it took them a couple years to realize that the shape of the cigar cars actually created lift, and the lowest the car ever sat was in the pits when it was stationary. So that's when you started seeing the cars take on a wedge shape before they allowed wings, just to try to develop that downforce to try to keep it down on the track. But they would notice as it would go down the straightaway, it would just slowly lift up, and they'd watch the suspension kind of stretch a little bit. And then as soon as they were on the brakes, they'd see the whole thing sit back down, and they're like, well, maybe we can figure out a way to skirt around the wing rules. And they started making the bodies just kind of a whole, they almost look like a door wedge shape, just to develop that downforce before they had ground effects and before wings were allowed.
I just think it's cool, like, that somebody had the forethought to take pictures of it on race day. You go see those over there?
No, I didn't see. What are you talking about?
Oh. You can see Dan Gurney in the car right here.
Oh yeah. I wonder, the driver had a part in the aerodynamics of the whole package back then, because so much of them stuck out the top. He was probably a lot less aerodynamic than Mario Andretti.
Yeah, a little top heavy too.
These ones are really good too.
Those are incredible resolution for that era.
Like, look at they have notes on it where you can see exactly how to restore it. That's cool.
What is that? Just like spray foam? Looks like spray foam.
And then if you notice in that picture, you can see up here all the different fuel cells. So you had a fuel cell on the top of you. You have two on the sides. You can see the connection points here. And those ran all the way alongside of you and one behind you. So I believe this one has 4 fuel cells. And you're basically in a tub of fuel. So
would they, I don't know if it was like this in this car, but didn't they eventually get to a point where they would have transfer pumps to move, like as it went down, they could move over back to the inside to keep it where they wanted it?
Yep, and Mario Andretti helped develop that in 1965 in a Bronner Hawk. Most of them have a pipe a few years beyond this that runs right underneath your legs, so right about here. And they developed a system where while he was in the car, he could essentially use it as a weight jacker. So as the balance would start to go away, he would say, okay, I'm gonna start using fuel from this side of the car and keep the weight on the inside. If he started developing a little bit of a push or something, he could adjust and control the levels as he went down. And I believe that he was the first one to kind of do that actively in the car. Of course, you know, every driver has a claim of like what they developed, but that's what he told us when we were going through his Bronner Hawk that we have in the collection. So yeah, little interesting things like that, you know. And we asked him, we're like, was that illegal? And he said, no, we were just the first ones to think of it. You know? Why not use the fuel as a ballast? This is what sits on your lap. So it's all the
So
fuel cells.
you get in the car and then put that on you.
They'll usually keep it in, you know, unless they're...
Oh, it goes over your legs.
Yeah, it goes over your legs, so it kind of sits on the frame. You can see the connection point right there on this side. But yeah, they would try to make as few stops as possible, and that was another advantage, was not only the lightweight helped them use less fuel, but they wanted to pack as much as they possibly could on the driver to save that time in the pits, because the pit stops could be, you know, 30, 40 seconds.
Are all the fuel cells made of fiberglass?
They used to be. After this race, there was actually an incident, a fatality, I believe it was lap 2, and a lot of it had to do with fuel cells rupturing. So they actually mandated these, Firestone helped develop these rubber fuel cells that were like burst resistant. So that kind of changed the game. And then everybody was required to use those. So no more fiberglass after this year.
What year was that went really, really bad? Was it 71? Where there was like the big fiery crashes and it was just awful?
It was this year.
It was this
Or sorry, it was the year after. It was 64.
Okay, is that what you're talking about then?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, it was 64. It was Eddie Sachs and Dave McDonald. They collided. Dave McDonald kind of had an experimental car, and they were messing with the rules because the car had somewhat enclosed wheels, so the aerodynamics gave them a big advantage, and then they made them use skinnier tires, and the ride height got thrown off, so he lost control, hit the inside wall and spun back out, and then Eddie Sachs ran into him, and there was a big explosion. So that's when they started looking into the burst resistant fuel bladders, mandating those, and they started switching from gasoline to all alcohol based fuel and methanol after that point.
Why does this cap have R12 on it? Isn't that a refrigerant?
Ooh, see, that's beyond me. That is, I've almost expelled my knowledge of this car as the as the content guy.
At least you're honest. Some people will just make stuff up.
No, I don't want to do that.
Also, they got looks like a conventional Z-bar, or maybe it's not a Z-bar because there's no actual Z-bar in this car, but a mechanical clutch linkage. In a normal car, you just have the Z-bar with a little rod that will push on that. And they haven't got that far yet. I'm interested to see how that pedal gets to that thing.
And I can't remember on the gearbox, I can't remember if this is the 4-speed or the 2-speed. I believe the 64 car is a 2-speed, which was pretty common on oval setup. You know, you just have a high and a low. But this is a Colati T37 gearbox, and they had 2 variations, the 4-speed and the 2-speed gearbox.
This old Pennzoil
Yeah, there's some goodies around here. You'll see some of the old pictures that have been in here for ages and ages.
Are there any pictures of this shop when it was building actual, I mean, I guess these are actual race cars, but you know what I mean, when it was the shop?
I'll have to look around for those. I'll have to go through the IMS photo wall and see what we have. I know there are Rex coffee cans everywhere.
When did this place stop being a functional race shop and turn into this?
I believe in the 60s, or I'm sorry, the 70s. So we opened the museum as we know it today in 1976. And for the last several decades, this has been kind of the home for repairing all of our cars here. And we've recently just kind of, we had 2 guys doing all of it forever, just 2 guys. And they had to man the whole collection. Now we're up to, between some part-time guys and the full-time guys, we have about 7 restoration mechanics. Even our in-house detailer, he's a pretty good mechanic himself too, so he'll jump in and help us get some of these cars ready. And it's everything from old race cars and sports cars to Indianapolis passenger cars, so they've got to know a little bit of everything.
Look at these pictures. This is in this shop. Those are the same windows that are over here.
Oh, you're right. Wow. Yeah, good call.
Yes.
I did not see that. It's so faded.
Yeah, it's
And-
really cool.
That looks like it might even be the same heater up there. Well, no, it's just a different old one. Maybe.
I think it's from that garage door like angle, that door angle.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You guys ever come in here with like a camera from 1960 and put some stuff in here and just take a picture and have it done on like the old film so it looks like an old picture?
I'd love to do that.
I would totally do that.
I try with filters sometimes, but when you see them in here and they've got the crew shirts on working on these things, like sometimes it takes you back to looking at the old footage and it's like, man, you know, not much has changed because when you work on these cars, you got to use the same tools and same procedures. So
It's really a time warp. You like just standing in here.
Yeah.
I like this garage a lot. It reminds me of the garage that I built my stuff in back in Pennsylvania before I moved out. It
Oh,
was
yeah.
like built in the 20s or something, and it's, you know, the block and the tables and everything. It's just really neat. Bob is a cool dude.
Did you see this?
1962.
That's cool.
Wow. I wonder if some of this stuff are things that they just found in here, like behind drawers or under things, and
Why were those rows marked out?
I don't know, confidential.
almost all those old pictures and anything like that they found going through the drawers when we redid these. We just kind of went through, and when we hired Dan Rosenauer, our restoration head, he was like, we're gonna organize everything, we're gonna put like the machining stuff on this side over here and put some of these new cabinets in, and they kind of had the privilege of going through every single nut and bolt for a few months and found some cool old artifacts along the way.
For IndyCar guys, like NASCAR guys, when they damage something, did they like throw it behind the shop and there's stuff buried underground?
Oh yeah, it's you'll find there was a guy I think out on the East Coast, I can't remember his name, but he'll go through and he'll find super modifieds that were made out of old roadsters from the 50s and 60s, like Indy racing roadsters, because back then, you know, the cars had no value if they were outdated. As soon as the technology had surpassed them, you know, when these cars showed up and started winning, well, what do? Okay, let's chop it up, turn it into a super modified race somewhere else, or just throw it in the back of a garage somewhere. You know, and some of our collection was acquired that way because we'd get things donated to us that, in their eyes, were never going to be valuable again. You know, if it hadn't won the 500, what are you going to do with it? And there's so much surplus too because of, you know, after World War II, almost all the fitments, all the fasteners, that was all Army surplus stuff. So from the bases out in California, these race engineers and mechanics would go out and just buy up all that unused Army surplus and build race cars out of it. So
That's where AN fittings became commonplace in hot rod world. And
Really?
Yeah, if you guys watching didn't know, AN is Army Navy. That's what that comes from.
That's pretty neat. Yeah, we've got drawers full of that stuff.
I saw these new bins and I figured they were just new hardware, but they're not. These are like, where did you guys find this stuff at?
So this was in the other shop. Most of it, we had coffee cans that we found full of unsorted nuts and bolts and washers and fittings, and they spent months going through it and organizing them all out.
It's like a hodgepodge of old and new and so this says Poppy on it. Is that
I'm guessing that's our Poppy.
Yeah, Poppy has his special welding gloves with his name on it.
Oh yeah.
this is a vintage AN fitting right here. One of a kind. Can't tell you anything else about it other than it's cool because it's old. Let's see what's in the metric crap drawer. Not very much. If you enjoyed this video, which you must have because you watched the whole thing, we highly suggest you go check out the video we filmed at the Museum of American Speed in Nebraska. There's a ton of cool Indy cars in there with unique engines and crazy stuff that honestly would be right at home at the IMS museum itself. There will be a link to that in the description. If you're new here and you'd like to see more videos like this, it helps if you subscribe and hit the thumbs up on the video. That way it will be more likely to recommend a future video that we post to you when you open YouTube. And now we've gotten a handful of comments and emails and messages in the last couple months of people saying that they subscribed and the YouTube unsubscribed them for some reason. I don't know why that happens. I wish I could fix it, but I don't have the power to do that at the moment, unfortunately. I wish we did, but I know that hitting the bell and hitting thumbs up and commenting on the video, like the more interaction you have with it, the more likely you are to see what we post next, regardless if you're subscribed or not. I know it's stupid, that's how it works. I probably need to figure out maybe like an outside way to notify people, like an email list or something. You could do like a monthly recap. That way you could at least stay up to date without us bugging you all the time. Because you know when you get too many emails from people, you don't even look at them at all. Maybe that's just me. I don't know. What do you think? What do you think I should do? Is there a better way to get that out there that doesn't depend on a system to do it or forget about it? I don't know. Help me out. Logan's in there working on her car, which you're going to see videos of very soon. This car behind me, putting together for a Grand National Super Series where they run these old Busch cars and Cup cars. And it is getting this legitimate Dodge R5 P7. I think it's an old truck series engine. But yeah, so all that'll be in build videos as well, coming very soon.